Part 5. Calvin lays emphasis repeatedly upon the duty of obedience to magistrates as vice-regents of God. So far as the individual citizen is concerned, this rule of obedience applies even to tyrannical rulers who seem to be in no sense representatives of God. An impious king is thought of as a scourge visited upon a people in punishment for sin, yet he too possesses a divine authority. Old Testament passages are adduced here. Jeremiah represents God as calling Nebuchadnezzar my servant and commanding the people to serve him and live, though in fact he was a pestilent and cruel tyrant. Under a wicked ruler, we are not to rebel, but to consider our own sins and implore the help of God. This is not futile, for God does intervene to lay tyrants low, sometimes raising up leaders who are his appointed instruments of revolution even when they know it not. Let princes hear and fear. The passage here selected from the commentary on Romans accords with these views. The magistrate, in punishment, exercises the vengeance of God against the violation of his commandment. Calvin remarks that no private man may seize the reins of government from the appointed ruler. In paragraphs not included in the selection, he applies to government the principle of charity, which is the fulfillment of the law. To induce anarchy is to violate charity. Obedience to magistrate is a great part of charity. But we create a wholly false impression of Calvin's political ideas if we give sole attention to his exhortations to obedience. It will be observed that in commenting on Romans 13:1, he stresses the point that Paul speaks of a higher, not of the highest power. The ruler has no authority that contends with God's. Calvin frequently reminds us that we must obey God rather than men. Acts 5:24. In the last edition of the Institutes, he reinforces this argument in the final paragraph of the work by fresh Bible text. In Daniel 6:22, the king has abrogated his authority by raising his hand against God, and Hosea 5:11 condemns the submissive obedience of the Israelites to the decrees of Jeroboam II enjoining idolatry. God does not resign his right to mortals when he makes them rulers. Nor does Calvin deprive subjects of all right of resistance. The classical passage here is in the Institute or Book 4, Chapter 20, verse 31, which is in all editions of the work. So far as private persons are concerned, they are never permitted to resist. But if there are magistrates whose constitutional function is the protection of the people against the license of kings, such as the efforts of Sparta, the Roman tribunes, or the demarches of meetings of the three states in the several modern kingdoms, it is not only their right but their duty to oppose the king's violence and cruelty. It would be nefarious perfidy for them to fail in this duty, and thus betray the liberty of the people. How should we understand this reference to the ancient popular magistrates and to the estates in modern realms? Calvin introduces his reference to the latter with the word perhaps. This may suggest that he hesitated to regard them, or at least to regard all of them as functioning like the efforts of the protection of the people against tyranny. He was doubtless aware that the classes of ancient magistrates here mentioned were all elected by popular vote. This was not uniformly the case in the membership of the states. In some nations it was hardly the case at all. If he possessed detailed knowledge of the states of parliaments of England, Scotland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and Spain, of the diets of the Swiss Confederation and the imperial diets of Germany, He would observe wide differences among them in constitution and function, and in potentially for defense against monarchical absolutism or tyranny. But Calvin would have in mind primarily his native France, and he could not fail to be aware that the French estates had not even met since 3 years before his own birth. Lifetime, any expectation that the three estates would redeem France from absolutism was faint indeed. His perhaps may be in relation to France, and expressing an expression of doubt regarding the very survival of the institution. Yet it is noteworthy that in all these European organs of quasi-representative government he saw at least the possibility of some guarantee of liberty and security for the people. His words here, in fact, an invitation to those bodies to play the role of the efforts and check the irresponsible arrogance of kings. This emphatic and suggestive passage opened a path for writers like Francis Hodgman and the authors of the Vindice contra Tiranos, who a few years after Calvin's death would, would frame doctrines of resistance that were to be vastly influential in the practical world. It is also it also gave suggestion to the British 17th century political prophets Rutherford, Sidney, and Locke. It was not the less but more influential in that it came as a concession at the end of a discussion that is anxiously conservative. Part 6. That Calvin was hostile to monarchy as a form of government has been affirmed and denied by equally competent scholars. At times, he refuses to choose among the forms of government, and he avoids any blanket denunciation of the royal office. The piety of some Bible kings would exclude that. He has, as we saw, a high ideal for the behavior of kings. Good government under a king is for him a possibility. Yet the fact is that he is habitually severe in his judgment of the kings of history and of his own time. This characteristic is most marked after the inception of the severe persecution of Henry II in France and of Mary in England, but no express connection with these matters appears in his treatment. Denunciations of bad kings who come to notice in the commentaries readily and frequently lead to expressions of unqualified disparagement of kings in general. Calvin's sermons on Job and on Deuteronomy offer numerous instances of this. We have included here, chiefly to illustrate the point, selections from his lectures on Daniel, a work of his Book of Daniel, a story of heroic fidelity and divine deliverance, lent itself to treatment by the spokesmen and counselors of the harassed minority of Protestants in France. And Calvin devotes 66 lectures to its 12 chapters. The work bears a dedicatory epistle to the pious in France, in which Daniel's memorable example of incredible constancy is held before them, along with the goodness of God at the close of this tragedy. In these lectures we may sometimes discern an allegory of French affairs of the times. Nebuchadnezzar's wishes to have in his kingdom no dissent religious minority. He is blinded by pride, and to this day we see what with what arrogance all earthly monarchs conduct themselves. His officers obey his edicts, since they have no religion but that of their fathers. Lecture 13. Daniel, Calvin notes, presents in the Babylonian kings a description of the greatness of a royal power exercised not because it is lawful, but by tacit consent of subjects who dare not murmur. Belshazzar fails to learn from the punishment of Nebuchadnezzar's pride. Lecture 25. It is Darius who is the type of royal incapacity and misgovernment. Yet he is not so bad as modern kings. His initial recognition of virtue in Daniel suggests that we ought to weep over the heartlessness of kings in these days, who proudly despise God's gift in all good men. We see how unworthy of their power kings usually are. Their favorites are flatterers, panders, and buffons. Lecture 27. Darius yields to the counsels of evil and designing nobles. At each stage of his moral downfall, Calvin generalizes on modern kings. If one could uncover the hearts of kings, he would find hardly one in 100 who does not despise everything divine. Lecture 18. Yielding to weakened persuasion, kings become slaves of their own servants. A prisoner in a dungeon is freer than they. Thus, slaves rule the kingdoms of the world. Lecture 19. When one has perused many such passages, it is difficult to accept that the judgment of those who hold that the reformer has no hostility toward the monarchical form of government. A growing revulsion towards kingship itself seems to be involved in his persistent and often sweeping denunciation of kings. On the other hand, it is manifest that Calvin is anxious to avoid the language of political revolution. He quotes Honor the King and observes that it is in vain for those who have no part in determining the future of government to dispute about it. Which, which form of this disadvantage will depend upon circumstances. But in the 1543 edition of the Institute, he introduced following this neutral statement that flat assertion that aristocracy or aristocracy tempered by democracy far excels all other forms. He retained this praise in the 1559 edition, supporting it on the ground that justice, rectitude, and discernment are rare in kings. He then adds, the vice and inadequacy of men thus renders it safer and more tolerable that many hold the sway so that they may mutually be helpers of each other, teach and admonish one another, and if one asserts himself unfairly, the many may be censors and masters, representing his willfulness. Thus, Calvin clearly takes his stand upon a plural magistracy as contrasted with a monarchy. There is safety in numbers, who can check the ambition of anyone disposed to seek domination. This, it may be noted, is a reversal of the view of Saint Thomas Aquinas, who, in the governance of princes, argues for monarchy from the principle of unity, chapter 2, and from the judgment supported by the example of ancient Rome, that government by the many more often turns into tyranny than government by one. In Geneva, the scriptural principle of mutual admonition, of fraternal correction, in which Calvin here sees a safeguard against arrogance, was incorporated into the constitution of the Church. Moreover, in 1557, Calvin induced the Little Council, the chief organ of civil government, to adopt the practice of a quarterly meeting for mutual criticism in fraternal charity. The proceedings of this session were kept secret. There are other passages that guide us to an understanding of the concise sentences from the Institutes. On Romans 13:4, he notes that rulers are obligated to God and to men. On Micah 5:5, he finds authorization for the popular election of rulers. He takes the word shepherds there in the sense of political rulers and observes, power, sorry, for the condition of the people most to be desired is that in which they create their shepherds by general vote. For when anyone by force usurps the supreme power, that is tyranny. And where men are born to kingship, this does not seem to be in accordance with liberty. Hence, the prophet says, "We shall set up princes for ourselves." That is, the Lord will not only give the church freedom to breathe, but also institute a definite and well ordered government, and establish this upon the common suffrages of all. The system here clearly favored is one that results upon popular election, which is also thought of as the work of God. Without the slightest sense of incongruity, the theocratic and democratic principles are drawn together. The blend of aristocracy and democracy that he recommends as superior to all other forms of government should be thought of in the light of this. When he speaks of aristocracy as the rule of the principal persons, he is in all probability not thinking of any hereditary ruling case. He sees liberty infringed when kings are born to kingship, and we may assume that the principal persons are not such by inheritance, but through the recognition of their qualities by their fellows. It would be perilous, however, to press this point too far. Where a hereditary nobility exists, it has some actual authority and influence which ought to be brought to bear for good government, and thus entails a specific responsibility. Calvin would have agreed with John Knox, whose political attitude was in general more revolutionary than his, when the reformer writes, "The to bridle the fury and rage of princes in free kingdoms and realms, it pertains to the nobility, sworn and born to be councillors of the same, and also to the barons and people, whose votes and consent are to be required in all great and weighty matters of the commonwealth." Part 7. Calvin became a citizen of Geneva only after his own completion of the last edition of the Institute. He had already committed himself to views consonant with membership in a republic, and had helped to reshape the constitution and laws of the city. The system of government was that of a conservative democracy. Calvin's word for democracy, politia, came to him from past ages with suggestions of disorderliness and anarchy which he largely retained, and which in many European minds still attach to the word democracy itself. He is cautious, therefore, in his use of the term, but his aristocracy-democracy formula is not only consistent with a republican order of government, but in fact conducive to it. In the commentaries, he frequently expresses warm praise for liberty, and this is sometimes associated with the right of the people to elect their rulers. Twice in the homilies and on 1 Samuel he refers to liberty as an inestimable good. The same language is used in the commentary on Jeremiah, and in a reference to Deuteronomy 24:7, liberty is characterized but as more than the half of life. These sentences from his sermons on Deuteronomy indicate his wholehearted approval of the elective principle. When, in the days of the judges, God gave such a privilege to the Jews, he ratified thereby his adoption and gave proof that he had chosen them for his inheritance, and that he desired that their condition should be better and more excellent than that of their neighbors, where there were kings and princes but no liberty. If we have the liberty to choose judges and magistrates, since this is an excellent gift, let it be preserved and let us use it in good conscience. If we argue about human governments, we can say that to be in a free state is much better than to be under a prince. Disputes of this sort are unprofitable, but it is much more endurable to have rulers who are chosen and elected, and who acknowledge themselves subject to the laws, than to have a prince who gives utterance without reason. Let us use it as a singular benefit and a treasure that cannot be prized enough. Thus, the priceless boon of liberty it is to be cherished and defended, but it is not to be sought by violent revolution, and not to be expressed in ways that escape the bounds of law. Calvin's idea of good government is concisely stated. I readily acknowledge that no kind of government is more happy than this, where liberty is regulated with becoming moderation and properly established on a durable basis. In February 1560, on the eve of an election, he addressed the General Assembly of citizens, urging them to choose their magistrates with a pure conscience, without regard to anything but the honor and glory of God, for the safety and defense of the Republic. Thus, theocracy and democracy were easily and naturally associated in his teaching, and impressed by him upon the city-state that was the special sphere of his activity, in which he sought to establish, according to his pattern, a regulated and enduring liberty. To our modern minds, in Calvin's Geneva, the regulation outweighed the liberty. It is idle to estimate the experiment by modern standards, but, at any rate, under the system of governing elective councils and of annual elections, the constitutional means of revision were maintained. Calvin was no modern man, and he was not writing in the interest of secular conceptions of democracy. Government was for him concerned with what we call right of man, only in relation to a scriptural concept of God, the moral law, and the perpetual rule of law. But from these presuppositions, he reached certain viewpoints that have lived political theory in modern liberal states, that have leavened political theory in modern liberal states. A study of the selections that follow will in some measure enable the reader to grasp these elements of his teaching and to appreciate their bearing upon the contemporary political problems and interests. And this is of the introduction by John T. McNeill.